Welcome to Beyond the Coverage. I'm Chris Horner. In today's edition, I want to talk a little bit about Lidl-Trek because they have 4 guys on the roster for this year's 24 Tour de France. Alex Kirsch, lead-out man for Mads Pedersen. Mads Pedersen being second, and of course, Ciccone, who had a fine Dauphiné ride. We saw Theo Gegenhardt crashed on stage 5 and they ended up dropping out of Dauphiné. But now it's reported, if you're popping onto your computer and you're looking at the websites, it's reported that Ciccone has the flu and Theo Gegenhardt has no luck whatsoever. He's got COVID. So what's going to happen here with Lidl-Trek? Well, they had 4 guys on. Now that means, let's say these 2 guys can't recover from the flu and COVID. Nobody knows whether they can't. We're so close to the Tour de France, I'm not predicting that. But let's say that they're sick, they can recover or they can't recover. If they can't recover, that leaves 2 guys on the roster right now, so they have to find 8 guys from Lidl-Trek that can transfer over and start the Tour de France. Now, we already know there's probably 6 or 7 that were on reserves that were thinking about doing the Tour de France, but who would those riders be? When we look at the Tour of Swiss, we see Skelmos. That's the guy that really highlights my list after Theo Gegenhardt and Ciccone leave. Now, Skelmos at Tour of Swiss, he was riding really well, but he had 1 or 2 days that was dropping a little bit, and he was getting dropped from a group of 10, maybe 12 guys left. Then he'd come back and he'd be up there chasing Adam Yates and Almeida and riding the front and having solid climbs again. And then he finishes 3rd on the general classification after what was a really, really solid individual time trial. It was an uphill time trial, slightly flat at the beginning, of course, and then all up to the finish. So it was ideal time trial for Skelmos, but it shows that he's on very good form because he came back and took time from Egan Bernal from Team Ineos that spent a lot of time riding the front at the Tour of Swiss. Now, you heard me complain a bunch about the way they were riding, but Skelmos has to be the rider that you're thinking about going over to the Tour de France once you're losing Ciccone and when you're losing Theo Gegenhardt. He's like, Chris, I was already on the list. That's why I was riding good at Tour de Suisse. Okay, he was on the list. Sometimes the teams, don't want to announce the riders until the very late so they can get some more press going for the Tour de France. But if you look at Pro Cycling Stats, they list all the riders that they believe that have mentioned doing the Tour de France and guys that already are listed on doing the Tour de France, they put down there. Like I said, they had 4. We're talking 2. One's added if you're listening to me, and that's Skelmos. Now we start looking at other riders. If you look at Tour de Suisse, there's Thibaut Nice there. Thibaut Nice ended up winning stage 3 of Tour de Suisse, and he has won a ton of races. Something around 5 big races in the 2024 season. And one was at Romandy with an uphill finish. Then he won at Hungary, and then he won in Norway too. All of them are uphill finishes. So if Nice is going over to the Tour de France, they're not really hurting in terms of replacing riders. When we start looking at the rest of the list, you can see Carlos Verona going over. He did Dauphiné, looks solid at Dauphiné, always up there with Ciccone late into the final climb and then dropping off where Ciccone would be on his own. But he got all the way into the final climbs of Dauphiné. So we see Carlos Verona. He's definitely a rider that you can put on there. When we start looking at some of the other riders, Bach Mollema, but Bach Mollema didn't finish his last race, so possibly he has some issues where he's at Tour of Swiss. I don't know if he crashed out there. I didn't watch all of the stages of Tour of Swiss. I just watched the last final climbs there at Tour of Swiss and watched Adam Yates and the Almeida show that was happening when they were going up the last climb. But Bach Mollema wasn't in the picture to finish Tour of Swiss, so he could have some issues of why he's not at the Tour de France. But if you bring Bach Mollema to the Tour de France, and you're talking Skelmos, Nice, Bach Mollema, those are all guys that can win races at the Tour de France for sure. And we know Bach Mollema can because it's on his resume. It's getting a little more up there in age, of course, but we're coming in the Tour de France. That would be a highlight objective if he's on the list. We start looking further down, and I want to take you back to the Giro where we saw Ed Toons and we saw Jasper Stuyvens doing amazing leadouts for Johnny Milan. No, I don't believe Johnny Milan's doing the Tour de France because it's not on his roster at this moment, and he hasn't raced since the Giro. But Ed Toons and Stuyvens have been racing the Tour of Belgium, the Belwas Tour, so they've been on good form, especially Jasper Stuyvens. I've seen him getting a top 5 finish there at Belwas Tour, so I believe he should be there at the Tour de France starting. That means Mads Pedersen, when it comes into the leadouts, he'll have Ed Toons, he'll have Jasper Stuyvens, and Alex Kirsch leading him into all those sprint finishes that he wants a shot at winning, and then you have Thibaut Nice doing the more uphill finishes that are still kind of good for Mads Pedersen, but maybe a little steeper ones might be better suited for Thibaut Nice than it would be for Mads Pedersen. Either way, even if you throw in nice helping out with the lead out on those slightly uphill finishes for Mads Pedersen, Lidl-Trek looked like they should be able to win a stage at the Tour de France, even minus Ciccone and minus, of course, the Theo Gegenhardt going out with COVID-19, if those two riders are not to be able to recover in time to start the Tour de France. Now, can they recover? Okay. I've had many times throughout my career where I was getting ready for the Tour de France. Very first one I was supposed to do in 1998 with FDJ. I was told I was doing the Tour de France. Crashed in that same stage race at Midi-Libre. They told me the morning of the last stage of Midi-Libre that I was doing the Tour de France, and I crashed in that same stage. Broke my wrist here, had to have surgery on it, lost the Tour de France. 2011, won the Tour of California, came back in 2012, and tried to win the Tour of California, but came up snake eyes. Pinched a nerve in my back on the last day there of Tour of California. I wasn't supposed to do the Tour de France because I wouldn't travel over for Dauphiné or Tour of Swiss because they needed recovery time, and then I had to beg and plead my way back on with Johan Bernal, who eventually let me onto the list, and I ended up finishing top 15 at the Tour de France, and that was last minute where I'm getting put on just the week or 2 weeks before the Tour de France started. So riders can get added, taken off, but it is a dilemma for the director sportifs when we're thinking about my experience with Johan Bernal running the team with Radio Shack. Remember, he wasn't there at Tour of California when I had the back problem, but I'm sure he's listening to everyone, all the staff and the management saying Chris couldn't even walk after the stage. And so he's thinking, I can't take him to the Tour de France, and then I can't go to Tour Dauphiné, I can't, Criterium de Dauphiné, excuse me, Tour of Swiss. I can't make either one of those, so he can't visually see me. So he has to go off with just my words, and a lot of begging and pleading got beyond there. But for the director sportif's perspective, when they're looking at guys like Ciccone and they're looking at Theo Gegenhardt not starting when you're Lidl-Trek, you got to start finding other options of pulling in 2 more guys. And originally, they were only thinking about finding 4 more guys, which I'm sure they had on their radar already, but then 2 leave. That's a huge hit when they're Theo Gegenhardt and their Ciccone, their GC guys. So hopefully Skilmos was already on the list, and it allows the Lidl-Trek director sportifs to be like, well, at least we have Skilmos to run something in the top 10 in general classification. And he looked pretty good at Tour of Swiss where he finished 3rd overall. But always dilemmas, always complications when you're going into a director sportif. Now, when we start looking at a couple other guys, the ones that come to mind for me is going to be Patrick Conrad. Patrick Conrad is a guy who can get through a lot of the climbs, can possibly win a stage at the Tour de France too from the breakaway. So they still got a solid list, another 8 riders they can pick from. But it gets slim picking if you got 8 right now, and maybe some of the guys were planning on doing a rest because Ed Toons and Jasper Stuyvens, I said I would put them on the list, but maybe they were planning on taking a break in July. Maybe they had other plans to bring those guys into the Tour of Spain later. So those guys already did the Giro. So now if they're doing the Tour, maybe I'm wrong up here, and you'd look at it from the director sportifs, the Lidl-Trek, saying, oh, we can't take Skilmos because we had him down for the Vuelta. We can't take Ed Toons. We can't take Jasper Stuyvens because they were planning on doing the Vuelta. Otherwise, we'll destroy the whole Vuelta team that we have such a limited numbers already picked for. And everything when we're looking at Lidl-Trek, they always are going to be focused on the Tour de France, especially with American bike sponsor. They want to go big in July. Remember, when I rode for Radio Shack, they were sponsored by Trek at those times for that 6-year period when I was with Astana, Radio Shack, and Leopard Radio Shack. That was a 6-year period, and Trek sponsored that team the whole time. It was always all hands on deck from the Trek American bicycle sponsor when the Tour de France started. They even sent their employees over. We were always bombarded at the hotel with Trek VIP guest riders coming over that we'd see maybe at dinner time, or they'd come over and say hi, and we'd always have someone from Trek representing them that's coming over always around the hotel. So for sure they got a little bit of dilemma here, but hopefully with a little bit of luck, Ciccone and Theo Gegenhardt will recover quickly and then they stay on the list. If they were to show up and they're not 100% fit, again, when I did it with Lampre in 2014, that was after winning the Vuelta a España in 2013, but it was after I was hitting the tunnel in the early springtime, right around Paris-Roubaix time, so talking about April, when I got hit in the tunnel. And I was 6 weeks from getting off the hospital bed, getting a second tube put down into my lung to expand my lungs. And I remember talking to Brent Copeland, the manager there of Lampre, and he basically told me as I was getting off the operating table that if you can make the Tour de France, you're on the list, because we don't have pure climbers to go there and help Rui Costa, the Portuguese rider that was the ex-Road World Champion, current Road World Champion at that moment, because he'd won the year before in 2013. So for me, depending on what team you're on, with Lampre, like, because I'm a pure climber, they said, hey, if you can make it, we're going to take you. So when I made the Tour de France in 2014, my main objective, getting through the first week of racing where we started up in England, went over to France. We had to do the cobblestone stage 5 there up from Paris-Roubaix, going across those. It was where basically Vincenzo Nibali ended up winning the Tour de France on that stage through the cobblestones because he made the front group. Chris Froome crashed out. Alberto Contador wasn't there with Vincenzo Nibali, then later crashed out with a knee injury. But for my experience myself, when you're coming in sick and not 100% at the Tour de France, because this is the biggest time of the year when everybody's on their best form. So if Theo Gegenhardt and Ciccone aren't on their best fitness, would I still take them to the Tour de France? Absolutely, as long as they've only missed 3, 4, 5 days tops and they still have that week of spinning their legs. Both riders were on pretty good form, Ciccone especially. Theo Gegenhardt, as I told you guys, he crashed at Dauphiné. Now with COVID, that might be too much of a break for Theo Gegenhardt to come into the Tour de France and be good. But it's doable as long as when they come into that first week of the Tour, they just say, okay, we're racing for stages. We're not going to go big on stage 1 when you 18 members are drilling at the front of the peloton. Okay, Lidl-Trek's got their hands full. Let's move on to something else as hopefully they survive there with Theo Gegenhardt and Ciccone getting healthy just in time for the Tour de France. One other thing I want to talk about, we got a little bit more time, is the watts per kilo. We see so many times riders talking about watts per kilo and 7 watts per kilo going up the last climb, and they're listing off riders that just clearly, there's no way they pulled 7 watts per kilo. I've seen many places where one comment put in there about the Angaroo time, and he was talking about, well, Primoz Roglic did about 40 seconds faster than your time on the Angaroo in 2013. We know Jonas Vingegaard was on his wheel. Sepp Kuss pulled another 20 seconds, so almost 30 seconds on me on the Angaroo time. But that commenter said, but with the equipment and with the conditions, maybe maybe their time's closer to mine. When I did the Angaroo in 2013, I was the fastest in the peloton going up that. The breakaway ended up winning with Kenny Ellis on, but I was coming back with 5-minute deficit and almost brought it back down to just about 20, 30 seconds to Kenny Ellis on at the top. I pulled 6.3 watts per kilo. That time of just over 43 minutes held second best time ever up the Angaroo. When we look at the Vuelta a España, they passed through it about 3 different times. And last season was when Primoz Roglic beat my time by, like I said, 30, 40 seconds on my personal best time there in 2013. But when we look at his time, the difference is when you're comparing watts per kilo, and everybody's so eager to say, this rider pulled 7 watts per kilo. Well, when we start looking at the times there from Primoz Roglic, Jonas, and Sepp Kuss, remember if you watch 2013, Vincenzo Nibali attacked me straight from the bottom. So it's basically me on the front in the wind the whole time up the climb. So that's a pure calculation that's easier to do. There was times when I was on Vincenzo Nibali, times when we slowed down, times when we stopped. When you're watching us slow down and stop, you know we're slowing down because you see that it's Valverde coming back, Joaquim Rodriguez coming back to our wheel. They'll get dropped again. They'll come back when we slow down again. So when you look at my time there and Vincenzo Nibali's going up the Angaroo in 2013, remember, we're stopping, we're slowing down, we're speeding up, we're playing tactical games. At no point in time was I really on anyone's wheel other than when the Astana rider from Vincenzo Nibali, his teammate, was caught from the break, and that was Tirlago. When he started coming back from the break, there was a point in time where he got on the front, started to pull in for Vincenzo Nibali for a short period of time where I'm actually getting a draft. When you start comparing, though, with Jumbo-Visma's time, the 3 leaders from last year, they go full gas without pulls on the front of the peloton. He's going full up the climb, and then Roglic is launching himself. We go back to that comment and he said, well, of course, maybe they might have pulled a couple watts better than you, and I pulled 6.3 watts. So nobody pulled 7.0 watts per kilo on last year's 2023 Vuelta a España. We know that for sure, as we know Primoz Roglic was on the wheel going all the way up the climb to about 2.5 kilometers ago when he launched his attack, and then he was in the wind the whole time. But I'm doing 5 kilometers basically in the wind. He's doing 2.5 kilometers in the wind. And I bring this up because that magical 7.0 watts per kilo is always thrown out there. There was a commenter that brought it up that somebody in Tour of Swiss was pulling 20 minutes of 7.0 watts per kilo at Tour of Swiss. Nobody pulled 7.0 watts per kilo at Tour of Swiss for the whole length of a final climb. We know because every time you look at the group, when I'm sitting on Chesterfield, I see it, the group's 10 riders strong, and we see that sometimes when it's 15, it's Brandon Rivera on the front. he's not pulling 7 watts per kilo. If on the stage that skill most, who could be making this year's Tour de France, that's why I'm bringing him up because I already talked about him in the video, on the day that he got dropped, he's getting dropped with 15 guys in the front. If he got dropped because everyone's doing 7 watts per kilo, he wouldn't be having conversations with his director sport, with his trainer and his coach saying, I don't know why I blew. He would have just came up there publicly when he's doing his interviews instead of saying, well, sometimes you have a bad day, sometimes you don't have a bad day. We don't always know why. He would have just said, everyone's doing 7 watts per kilo. I've never pulled that in my life. They went super fast. I got dropped. The next days they weren't. Okay, so he never said that. They're not pulling 7 watts per kilo. Adam Yates was never in the wind long enough to do a 20-minute section for the commenters to say, well, hey, he did 20 minutes at 7 watts per kilo. That couldn't have happened either. The only rider really riding any length of time on the last climbs of Tour Swiss was Almeida when he's getting on the front with about 6 kilometers to go. And I've done the math on him when I'm watching it. There's no way he's pulling 7 watts per kilo. Otherwise, no one would be left on his wheel. And Adam Yates wouldn't be able to attack him later if he's pulling 7 watts per kilo. He'd be solo. So anytime you see somebody, especially later, talk about some spectacular ride. I can't remember how many times I've heard when somebody wins a stage, they're like, oh, they're spectacular. They pulled 7.0 watts per kilo. It's not true. When you look at the Angleroo time, my watts per kilo when you're going up the climb there at the Angleroo, 6.3 watts per kilo. And guys, it took till last year for somebody to break my time. And I could tell you personally, I could go a bit faster than that 6.3 watts per kilo because, again, we slowed down. Vincenzo Nibali and I attacked each other left and right. Slowed, stop, slowed, stop, slowed, stop. So yes, I could go a little bit faster up the Angleroo. But 7.0 watts per kilo, that's someone that is like a Tadej Pogacar that's just exploding off the pedals going up the final climb. Or it's a Jonas Vingegaard, Primoz Roglic, Remco Evenepoel for short periods of time. But up the whole climb, 7 watts per kilo. I just don't see it happening. To put it in perspective, that's a 4 or 5 minute faster time on L'Angliru than the time I pulled in 2013. And equipment, as we go back to that commenter that responded to me, equipment explains some of the speed that Primoz Roglic, Jonas Vingegaard, and Sepp Kuss had at last year's Vuelta a España. But it doesn't explain all of it. And equipment, no matter how tall their socks are getting, guys, it's not making up 7 watts per kilo. Otherwise, you'd see my record from the Angleroo had fallen apart and multiple guys would have just blew that record up left and right. So I don't believe in the mythical 7 watts per kilo in terms of the whole peloton doing it. Short moments, 5 minutes, 10-minute sections, a rider like Tadej Pogacar, sure. But overall, when you're going from the top to bottom and you're doing it on the final climb of a Grand Tour, I find it hard to believe that riders are pulling those kind of numbers. But can one rider do it? Can one of the top 4 on the first page? Quite possibly. Those riders are the best in the world. The 10 riders behind them? No way 10 riders on the final stage of a Tour de France or any Grand Tour out there is pulling 7 watts per kilo. If you see the group of 10 riders together, there's no way they're all pulling 7 watts per kilo, so you know it didn't happen. Make sure you guys like and subscribe. I'll see you guys on the next edition as we get prepared for the 2024 magnificent Tour de France that's starting real soon. Like and subscribe, and I'll see you then.